Jacob and Emily Hart had always dreamed of owning a little cottage in the countryside. Their new home, nestled at the edge of a sleepy village, seemed perfect. With its ivy-covered walls, creaky wooden floors, and a garden stretching all the way to a weathered old garage, it was everything they had imagined, quaint, serene, and full of character. "Just look at this place," Emily said as she stepped out of their car, arms wide to take in the view. "It's like a postcard." Jacob smiled, carrying the last box from the car to the front door. "It's perfect, Em. A fresh start for us." The first few days were a blur of unpacking and exploring. Each room seemed to hold a story, from the mismatched floorboards to the antique fireplace. Emily was drawn to the kitchen with its rustic charm, while Jacob spent his time outside, clearing overgrown weeds in the garden. At the very back of the property stood the garage, its windows fogged with grime and its door padlocked. "Have you looked inside this yet?" Jacob asked Emily one morning, tapping the rusted padlock. She shrugged. "Not yet. I thought maybe the key was inside the house, but I haven't found it." Curiosity got the better of Jacob. With a determined grin, he fetched his toolbox. "Let's see what's behind door number 1. It took some effort, a lot of grunting and a few choice curses, but the padlock finally gave way with a snap. The heavy metal door creaked open, releasing a musty, metallic scent that made Emily wrinkle her nose. Inside, the garage was dark, its only light seeping through the grimy windows. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like curtains from the rafters. In the centre of the room sat a large metal locker, its paint chipped and its corners dented. "What do you think's in there?" Emily asked, stepping closer. Jacob shrugged. "Only one way to find out." The locker was locked, just like the door had been. With more effort and the help of a crowbar, Jacob pried it open. The heavy door groaned as it swung out, revealing its contents. Inside were several items: faded photographs, rusted dog tags, and folded military uniforms, their colours dulled with age, but it was the helmet that caught Jacob's eye. "Wow," he said, lifting it out carefully. It was a steel combat helmet, marked with scratches and dents from use. A faded insignia was painted on the side, though it was difficult to make out. "This must be from the Second World War," Emily murmured, running a finger along the edge of the helmet. Jacob placed it on a nearby workbench, tilting his head to study it. "It's in pretty good shape, considering how old it must be." That night, as they settled into bed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unease. "Do you think it's weird that stuff was just left there?" she asked. Jacob chuckled. "Weird? It's a bit of history. Maybe the previous owner was a collector or something." Emily didn't respond, staring up at the ceiling. The wind outside howled against the windows, and somewhere in the distance a low, clattering sound echoed. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, sitting up. "Hear what?" Jacob mumbled, half asleep. "That noise, like something moving in the garden." Jacob groaned and got up, peeking out of the window. "Nothing there, Em. It's probably just the wind." But Emily wasn't convinced. Over the next few days, strange occurrences began to pile up. A faint clanging sound echoed from the garage at odd hours. The air in the garden felt colder than the rest of the property, even on sunny afternoons. Jacob dismissed it all as nothing more than an old house settling, but Emily was less certain. One afternoon, while hanging laundry in the garden, she glanced towards the garage and thought she saw a shadow move across the small, grimy window. "Jacob!" she called out, but he was inside, oblivious to her growing unease. That night, as Jacob worked in the garage, Emily stayed in the house, busying herself with unpacking. But when Jacob returned, his face was pale, his expression tight. "What's wrong?" Emily asked, setting down a box. "I swear I heard something in there," Jacob said, glancing back toward the garage. "Footsteps. And when I turned around, I could have sworn I saw someone standing by the workbench." Emily froze. "Someone? Did you check?" "Yeah, of course. There was no one there." Neither of them could sleep that night. The creaks and groans of the house suddenly more menacing, and in the dark silence they both swore they could hear faint sounds, the distant thud of boots, the faint clinking of metal. Unbeknownst to them, the helmet on the workbench seemed to glint faintly in the moonlight, as though waiting, watching. The following morning, the unease that had taken root in Emily's chest refused to leave. Jacob, on the other hand, seemed unbothered, or at least that's what he wanted her to believe. As Emily prepared breakfast, she glanced out the window towards the garage. It loomed at the end of the garden, dark and silent, its cracked windows reflecting the pale morning light. "Are you heading out to the garage today?" Emily asked, her voice casual but tight. Jacob shrugged, sipping his coffee. "I might. That helmet's pretty fascinating. I want to clean it up. Maybe do some research on it." Emily frowned. "I'm not sure we should keep it. It feels strange." Jacob chuckled. "It's just a piece of history, Em. Don't let your imagination get the better of you." But Emily couldn't shake the sense of dread. That evening, as the couple settled in for a quiet night, the first noise came. It started as a faint clinking sound, like metal tapping against stone. Emily froze mid-sentence, her eyes darting toward the window. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jacob frowned, setting down his book. "Probably the wind again." But the noise came again, closer this time. It echoed through the still night air, metallic and deliberate. "That's not the wind," Emily said, her voice shaking. Jacob grabbed a flashlight. "I'll check it out." "Be careful," Emily murmured, clutching a blanket tightly around her shoulders. He stepped outside into the cold night, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The garden was still, the only sound his boots crunching against the frost-covered grass. The garage door stood slightly ajar, though Jacob was sure he had closed it earlier. Inside, the workbench was exactly as he'd left it. The helmet sat in its place, the rest of the items untouched. Jacob lingered for a moment, listening to the oppressive silence. Just as he turned to leave, the faint sound of boots marching echoed around him. "Hello?" Jacob called out, his voice trembling slightly. The sound stopped abruptly, and the air grew colder. Later that night, Jacob couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of the garage and the unsettling noises. He drifted off eventually, but his rest was far from peaceful. He dreamed of a battlefield, muddy trenches stretching endlessly under a grey sky. The sound of gunfire and distant explosions roared in his ears. In the middle of the chaos stood a soldier, wearing the very helmet Jacob had found. His face was obscured by dirt and blood, but his hollow eyes burned with something Jacob couldn't describe. "Help me," the soldier rasped, his voice guttural and broken. Jacob woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The bedroom was silent, but a faint metallic clink sounded from the corner. His eyes darted toward the chair where he'd placed the helmet earlier that day. It was gone. "Emily," Jacob whispered, shaking her awake. "What is it?" she groaned, sitting up. "The helmet. It's not where I left it." Emily stared at him, fear flashing in her eyes. "Jacob, this is getting out of hand." Suddenly, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway outside their room. Jacob grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and crept toward the door. The hallway was empty, but the floor was icy cold beneath his feet. As he turned back toward the bedroom, a shadow moved at the edge of his vision. He whipped the flashlight around, illuminating the figure of the soldier standing at the far end of the hall. The man's face was pale and hollow, his uniform tattered and stained with mud. His eyes locked onto Jacob's, filled with desperation and anger. "Get out!" the soldier barked, his voice booming and echoing unnaturally. Jacob stumbled back into the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. The next day, Jacob tried to rationalize what he'd seen, but Emily was unconvinced. "Something's wrong with that helmet," she insisted. "We need to get rid of it." Jacob hesitated, torn between curiosity and fear. I need to understand what's happening." As the days passed, the noises grew louder. Footsteps, distant voices, and the faint whistle of wind that sounded disturbingly like screaming. Both Jacob and Emily began experiencing visions of war. Emily saw flashes of men running through trenches, their faces contorted with fear and pain. Jacob saw the soldier more clearly each time, standing closer, watching him with a mix of anger and sorrow. The atmosphere in the house grew oppressive. Lights flickered, objects moved on their own, and the temperature plummeted in certain rooms. One night, as Jacob stood in the garage, staring at the helmet, the soldier appeared again. "You don't belong here," the soldier growled. "This is my life, my war. You'll never understand the price I paid." Jacob's voice trembled. "What do you want from me?" The soldier's hollow eyes bore into him. "What was taken from me must be replaced." The words echoed in Jacob's mind long after the soldier vanished, leaving him alone in the dark, his breath visible in the freezing air. Jacob couldn't stay away from the helmet. It called to him, a silent whisper that seemed to echo in his thoughts. He spent hours in the garage, cleaning it meticulously, polishing its worn surface until the faded insignia became faintly visible, a cracked eagle symbol, barely recognizable through the years of rust and grime. Emily watched from the kitchen window as Jacob hunched over the workbench, his movements almost mechanical. The way he handled the helmet made her stomach churn, like he was cradling something alive. "Jacob, you've been out there all morning," she said, stepping into the garage. "Come inside and take a break." Jacob didn't turn around. "It's almost done," he murmured, his voice distant. When he finally looked up, Emily froze. His expression was cold, his eyes slightly sunken, as though he hadn't slept in days. For a fleeting moment, his face didn't look like his own. "You okay?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Fine," Jacob replied, but the word felt wrong, like someone else was speaking through him. That evening, Emily was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, when Jacob emerged from the garage. Her heart jumped. He was wearing the helmet. "What are you doing?" she asked, alarmed. "Just trying it on," Jacob said with a shrug, though his voice carried an unsettling edge. He stood straighter, his posture rigid and military-like. His eyes bore a distant look, as though he was seeing something she couldn't. "It suits me, doesn't it?" he asked, his tone eerily calm. Emily forced a laugh. "It's just weird, Jacob. Take it off." He hesitated, his hand hovering near the rim of the helmet. For a moment, Emily thought he wouldn't listen, but then he pulled it off, shaking his head as though waking from a dream. "Sorry," he muttered, setting the helmet on the coffee table. But the apology didn't erase the image of him standing there, stiff and cold, like a man she didn't recognize. Over the next few days, Jacob's behavior grew more erratic. He spent hours staring at the helmet, mumbling under his breath. At night, he tossed and turned, muttering things in his sleep, words Emily couldn't understand but sounded harsh and guttural, like commands. One morning, she woke to find Jacob sitting at the kitchen table, the helmet in front of him. He was staring at it intently, his fingers tracing the dented edges. "You've been acting strange ever since we found that thing," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's like it's changing you." Jacob snapped his head up, his eyes blazing with anger. "What are you talking about? It's just a helmet." Emily flinched. He had never spoken to her like that before. "Maybe we should get rid of it," she suggested, her voice trembling. "No," Jacob said firmly, his hand clutching the helmet. "It stays." That night, Emily awoke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Groggy, she got out of bed and peeked out the door. Jacob was pacing back and forth, wearing the helmet again. "Jacob," she whispered. He stopped and turned toward her, his face half hidden in shadow. For a moment, she saw something horrifying. His face seemed gaunt and aged, his eyes hollow and lifeless, like the soldier's. "Go back to bed," he said, his voice low and unfamiliar. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "What's happening to you?" Jacob didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the garage. The following day, Emily found Jacob sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the wall. He didn't even seem to notice her at first. When he finally looked at her, his expression was cold and detached. "Do you hear it?" he asked suddenly. "Hear what?" "The marching, the voices. They're all around us." Emily backed away, her heart racing. "Jacob, you need help." He stood abruptly, towering over her. For a moment, she thought he was going to hurt her, but instead, he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. That night, Emily was startled awake by the sound of smashing glass. She ran to the garage and found Jacob crouched on the floor, the helmet clutched to his chest. The workbench was overturned, tools scattered everywhere. "Jacob!" she shouted. He looked up at her, his face twisted in anguish. "He's in my head, Em. I can't make him stop." Emily stepped closer, her fear giving way to desperation. "We have to get rid of it. Whatever this is, it's not worth losing you." Jacob shook his head violently. "You don't understand. He needs me. He said he can't leave until he's whole again." "Who? Who said that?" "The soldier," Jacob whispered, his voice breaking. Suddenly, the garage lights flickered, and the air grew freezing cold. A shadow moved across the wall, larger than any man. Emily gasped as she felt a heavy presence pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. Jacob stood slowly, placing the helmet on his head. When he turned to face her, it wasn't Jacob anymore. His posture was stiff, his movements mechanical, and his eyes burned with an otherworldly light. "Jacob!" Emily whimpered. The figure tilted its head, a cruel smile spreading across its face.
"Not anymore."
Emily stood frozen in the garage, her heart pounding as Jacob, no, the soldier, stepped toward her. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, the cold gleam of something ancient and malicious staring out through her husband's face. "Jacob," she said, her voice trembling, "please, you have to fight this." The figure cocked its head, a mocking smile spreading across Jacob's lips.
"Jacob is gone. He gave himself to me. Now I am whole."
Emily's breath caught as the lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The air felt oppressive, heavy with an unnatural chill. "You're lying," she said, her voice growing stronger despite the terror clutching at her chest. "Jacob's still in there. I know he is." The soldier laughed, a hollow, bone-chilling sound.
"He was weak. He let me in, just like you'll let me stay."
Emily's mind raced as she backed away, her eyes darting around the garage for something, anything, that could help. Tools were scattered across the floor, and the overturned workbench lay between her and the soldier. "Get out of him!" she screamed, grabbing a wrench from the floor. The soldier's smile faltered, replaced by a cold glare. He raised a hand, and the air around Emily seemed to pulse. A sudden weight pressed down on her shoulders, making it hard to move, but she refused to give in. Emily swung the wrench, aiming for the helmet. The blow landed with a loud clang, and for a brief moment, Jacob's expression softened. "Emily," he whispered, his voice trembling with pain and desperation. "Jacob, you're still in there," she cried. But the moment was fleeting. The soldier snarled, wrenching control back as he shoved her across the garage. Emily hit the wall, gasping for breath, as the soldier loomed over her. "You can't have him," Emily said through gritted teeth, pulling herself to her feet. "He's not yours." The soldier hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Emily seized the moment, her eyes locking onto the helmet. "It's the helmet," she muttered to herself. "That's how he's controlling Jacob." Ducking under the soldier's outstretched arm, she grabbed a crowbar from the floor and swung it with all her strength. The blow struck the side of the helmet, sending Jacob reeling backward. Sparks of light erupted from the helmet, accompanied by an ear-splitting screech that made Emily's ears ring. Jacob fell to his knees, clutching his head. "Emily, help me." Tears streamed down her face. "I'm trying, Jacob. Hold on." The garage lights flickered wildly as the temperature plummeted. Shadows swirled around them, and Emily could feel the soldier's presence growing stronger, fighting to maintain control.
"You cannot win.
The soldier's voice growled, distorted and layered with echoes.
This body is mine."
Emily grabbed the helmet, ignoring the icy burn that seared her palms. "You want this so badly? Fine, take it back." Summoning every ounce of strength, she yanked the helmet off Jacob's head and hurled it across the garage. It clattered to the floor, rolling into the shadows. Jacob collapsed, gasping for air. Emily rushed to his side, cradling him as he trembled. "You're okay," she whispered, stroking his hair. "You're okay." But the shadows in the garage didn't dissipate. Instead, they coalesced around the helmet, forming a dark, writhing shape. The soldier's form began to emerge, his skeletal face twisted in rage.
"You think this ends here?"
He roared, his voice shaking the walls. Emily glanced at Jacob, who was barely conscious, and then back at the helmet. Her eyes landed on a can of gasoline near the garage door. "Not if I end it first," she muttered. She dashed to the can, her hands trembling as she splashed the fuel over the helmet and the surrounding shadows. The soldier screamed, his form flickering and distorting as the gasoline soaked into the cursed object.
"You will regret this,"
he hissed, his voice filled with malice. Emily grabbed a lighter from the workbench, her fingers fumbling as she struck it. The tiny flame wavered in the cold air before she tossed it onto the helmet. The garage erupted in light as the flames engulfed the helmet. The soldier's screams echoed through the space. Mingling with a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Emily shielded Jacob as the shadows writhed and thrashed, their edges burning away until nothing remained but ash and silence. When the fire died down, the helmet was nothing more than a twisted lump of metal. The oppressive chill in the air was gone, replaced by an almost eerie calm. Jacob stirred in her arms, his eyes fluttering open. "Emily," he croaked. She smiled through her tears. "You're back. It's over." Jacob's gaze shifted to the charred remains of the helmet, and a shiver ran through him. I could feel him in my head. He wanted everything. Emily helped him to his feet, supporting him as they left the garage. She glanced back one last time, her heart heavy with the knowledge of how close she had come to losing him. As they stepped into the house, the faint sound of boots marching echoed in the distance, but Emily refused to look back. The days that followed the destruction of the helmet were quiet. Too quiet. The oppressive weight that had lingered in the house since the day they moved in seemed to have lifted, leaving behind an uneasy calm. Emily and Jacob barely spoke of what had happened, though the memory of it lingered in their eyes. Jacob had insisted on finishing the job. "We'll bury it," Jacob said one evening, standing in the garden with the warped, blackened helmet in his hands. Its surface was twisted and melted from the fire, but it had survived. Emily hesitated. "Are you sure that's enough? What if it comes back?" "It won't," Jacob assured her, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. "I'll bury it deep, somewhere it can never be found." Together, under the pale light of the moon, they dug a hole at the farthest edge of the garden. Jacob placed the helmet inside, and Emily covered it with earth, her hands trembling as she patted down the soil. "Good riddance," she muttered, wiping her hands on her jeans. Jacob gave her a small, weary smile. "It's over, Em. We can move on now." For the next few days, things returned to a semblance of normal. Emily finally unpacked the last of their boxes, and Jacob spent his time repairing the damaged garage. The strange noises were gone, and the air in the house felt lighter. One night, as they sat together on the couch, Emily rested her head on Jacob's shoulder. "It's nice to have you back," she whispered. He kissed her forehead. "I'm not going anywhere." They went to bed that night, feeling, for the first time in weeks, truly at peace. Emily awoke in the early hours of the morning, her heart racing. At first, she wasn't sure why. The room was still and dark, with only the faint glow of moonlight spilling through the curtains. And then she heard it, the sound of boots marching in perfect rhythm. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more distinct. Emily's breath hitched as the footsteps seemed to echo through the house, growing closer. "Jacob," she whispered, reaching out to shake him awake. But the bed was empty. Panic surged through her as the footsteps stopped outside their bedroom door. The handle turned slowly, and the door creaked open. There, standing in the doorway, was Jacob. But it wasn't Jacob. He was dressed in full military garb, his uniform pristine and his boots polished to a mirror shine. His posture was stiff and formal, his eyes cold and empty. And atop his head was the helmet, now gleaming as though it had never been touched by fire. "Jacob," Emily gasped, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped into the room, his boots clacking against the wooden floor, his face twisted into a cruel smile. And when he spoke, it wasn't Jacob's voice. It was the soldier's.
"Oh, 500 hours, Private,"
the soldier barked, his tone harsh and commanding.
"Time for drills."
Emily shook her head, backing away until her back hit the wall. No. "This isn't happening." Emily screamed, tears streaming down her face as the soldier took a step closer.
"Stand at attention, Private,"
he roared, his voice echoing unnaturally through the room. Emily fell to her knees, sobbing. The soldier leaned down, his face inches from hers.
"You'll learn to obey,"
he sneered.
"just like he did."
Emily's screams filled the house as the soldier stood tall, the faint sound of marching boots echoing behind him. The next morning, the house was quiet. The bed was empty, the house eerily still. And somewhere, in the far-off distance, the sound of marching boots continued to echo, growing fainter with each step.